All right, so first thing I want to do is talk about objects. There are some notes here on JavaScript objects. I'm not going to go through this exactly. I'm going to talk about the same information, but I'm going to do like a little script on Replit. This is kind of related to if you look through these notes, this is related to making a P5 project. And so the concepts are the same here. So if you want to like review the notes here, basically, this is just like a little P5 project where you're controlling this little spaceship thing, which is really just a triangle. But all of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is the same. So, this is a good example, especially most of you guys should have done P5 at some point. So this would be a good example to take a look at if you want to review. So I'll put this in the voice chat, but I'm gonna just kind of make a new project that I'll share with you guys to talk about JavaScript objects. Um, so I'm gonna start a new Replit project. I'm gonna go over to Replit and just make a new project. And I'll stick with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and I'll just call this JavaScript objects. And click create. Okay, so I'll share this in the chat.
Didn't we go over objects in 210 though?
Did we?
I mean, triangle is an object. It's pretty easy to make in P5, just like uh, square and everything else.
So that's like uh not really exactly what I mean. Like an object is a specific programming concept. So like a triangle is an object in the general sense that like most things are objects, but in programming, object has like a very specific meaning. So that's what I'm gonna talk about. So that's a good thing to
Okay.
kind of address is that yeah, there is like this sort of what do you call it? Just like colloquial concept of an object. But what we're going to talk about is like the actual concept in programming. So yeah, that's a good thing to kind of clarify. Um, so yeah, I'm just going to jump over to the script here. I'm going to increase my font size. And I'm probably not going to make anything like super functional. I may print some stuff in the console for some examples. Um, but yeah, so we're talking about objects today. So JavaScript objects. And an object is, I'll just put some comments here as I describe this. So an object is in JavaScript, an object is a collection of what we call properties and methods, which is what we would normally think of as like variables and functions, but when they're attached to an object, they become properties and methods. So those words are kind of interchangeable. So a variable inside of an object is called a property, and a function that's part of an object is called a method. So I'll probably use both of those terms, and those are really kind of like important programming terms to be familiar with. So it's good to cover those. And so an object is basically just a way of collecting things. And so if you imagine when you're making a project, let's say we're making a tone project and you have like a synth, and you say like, I want this synth to do all this different stuff. And then you want to have another synth. So then you have variable synth number two. And then at a certain point you realize, well, I actually need like a ton of synths. And so then you're going to start to wonder, should I be making all of these different variables? Because then you're also going to want to know things like, what is the volume of synth one? And what is the volume of synth two? And your code is going to start to look really crazy if you have like all the parameters for your synthesizers and all the synths and all these different things are just one individual variable. Your code is going to start to get really kind of wacky looking. So one of the ways that we can avoid that is by collecting things that are together into an object. So in the P5 version of this example, I would always do like a spaceship. So like a spaceship has certain properties like a speed and a color. and a direction and a position, all these different things that could be their own variables, but if we collect them inside of an object, that makes things a little bit easier. So when we make an object, there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I'm just going to cover a couple. And part of why I'm talking about this is because we'll use it functionally in our code today, but also because when we're using Tone.js, everything in Tone.js is organized in objects. And we'll see examples of that in a bit. So if I want to make an object, I can, whoops, I can instantiate an object as a variable. So I can create an object, and this is a specific type of object called a object literal, and that just means it's assigned to a variable. So the way that that might look, if I was making a spaceship, I could say something like constant spaceship. I could use variable or let or whatever variable declaration I would want to use. But let's use a constant because I'm just going to have one in this case. And if I put a couple curly brackets like that, I have declared my object literal. And now I can assign properties and methods to this object. So I can say something like spaceship, whoops, dot x equals, or let's organize this a little bit better. Let's say it's like spaceship dot name equals, what's the name of the spaceship in Star Wars or Star Trek? What's the name of it? The Odyssey, is that right?
The Enterprise?
Enterprise, yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's say we have a spaceship and the name is the Enterprise. So now when we log our spaceship, uh, let's run our code. There we see this console is kind of small. I wish there was a way. Can I make this bigger? Display size. Oh, yes, we can. Okay. Oh, this just makes it taller. That's not bad. Okay, so let's make it a little taller. Is there like a font size? Okay, that's fine. At least it's taller. So there's our object, and it has inside of it this property called name, and the property name has the value enterprise, which is a string. And so now we have this little collection, and we can add to it. We can say spaceship dot position, and here's where we're going to get weird. We're going to say the position of the spaceship is its own little object. Maybe I skipped ahead a little bit too far, but let's just try it. So I can put an object inside of another object. So if we run this again, here's my spaceship, here's the name Enterprise, and here's the position, which is an object itself. So we have an object connected to an object. So another way that I can add properties to an object is directly inside of these curly brackets. So I can hit enter here and make a little more space on the screen, and my spaceship position needs a couple parameters. It needs an x value. So let's say the x value is 10, and then a comma, and we can add a y value. And we can say, let's say the y value is 0. And then here, different people have different preferences for how you would do this syntax. I usually like to add a comma here, but you don't have to have a comma for the last property or function that you add into an object. So it's kind of a matter of personal preference. I like adding a comma because who knows, I might want to add a Z position at some point if I change my program into a 3D program. So I'll usually add, this is called a trailing comma. So when I put properties into an object as I declare it, notice in this one, I just kind of created an empty object and then I started adding properties to it. I can also put my properties directly inside of the object, but I have to use different syntax. So this is where it's going to look a little bit more like what we'll see in Tone.js or some other instances where I have, for my syntax, if I'm writing inside of the curly brackets, I have the name of this new property. So this is like saying dot name. I'm just saying X. And then instead of an equal sign, I have a colon. And then I have my value, and I have to separate my values by commas. So that's generally what this syntax is going to look like. If I run this code, now I have a spaceship with a position, and inside the position I have an X and I have a Y here. So there's a lot of like different ways I can, kind of do stuff with objects. I'm just going to go over a few of them. Um, so another thing that I might want is a method or a function that's part of my spaceship. So I can say something like this, spaceship dot, um, let's say, what does a spaceship do? It launches. So we could say spaceship.launch, and I could assign that to a function. And this is like kind of goofy syntax that you may not have seen before, but instead of like creating a function the way I normally would, I can actually assign a function to a property of my spaceship. So if my spaceship launches, let's just go ahead and say spaceship dot position dot y equals let's just say 1,000. So it's not really that uh, uh, this is just an example. I'm just going to say that the spaceship is going into space. We're just taking the y value and increasing it by a lot. Um, and so now if we log our spaceship, let's log our spaceship's position. So I'm going to log spaceship.position before and after launch. So I'm going to log my spaceship's.position. Then I'm actually going to call the launch function. So defining the launch function doesn't actually run the code. It just defines the function that will happen if we call it. So now I'm going to call that launch function. I'm going to say spaceship.launch, and then I'm going to log my position again, spaceship.position. Oops. I should have chosen a shorter variable name. Okay, so now we can see, oh, you know what? It's logging. Okay, so this is a good thing to point out. In the logger, because it's an object, the reference is persistent, so it actually changes this previous version of it. But I think if we actually log y first, we'll see the difference. So let's log y and then launch and then log y again. Okay, there we go. So we have 0. Sorry, this is kind of small. Hopefully you guys can see this, but we have the position before launch is 0, and then we have the position after launch is 1,000. So let's put a little comment here, pre-launch and post-launch. Okay, so we have pre-launch is 0, post-launch is 1,000. So that's how we add a method. Another thing that we might do is add a method into an object. So let's do that with our position object as an example, since we already have it. Let's say I have an XY, and then let's say I want a function part of this position object in case I want to get the position. So I'll just call this method get, and this is going to look goofy as well. I can just write a function directly into my object. I can say get, and then I'm just gonna return, or let's just log it for here. Let's just say console.log, position, spaceship dot position dot x, spaceship dot position dot y. So now this method get is part of my spaceship.position function. So let's log our spaceship so we can see the whole object. And then let's log our method. So we'll say spaceship, or no, we don't have to log it because it's doing a log. So let's just say spaceship.position.get. Okay, so we have our pre-launch, our post-launch. Here's our spaceship. Now, here's our spaceship object. It has a launch method. It has a name, and then it has a position, which has an X and a Y, and then a get function that's part of the position object. So notice in my logger, the launch has like a little F next to it and a parentheses. So that's showing us that this name launch is associated with a function versus the name here, name, which is associated with data, the string enterprise. And then the position has a function, but it also has an X and, whoops, a Y value. This one is kind of hard to use. Let's go to the real full website and open up the console there. Okay, so here's our spaceship object. It has a launch function, it has a name, and has a position. And our position has the X value, the Y value, and then our get function. So you can see that objects can get quite complex, and the objects inside of Tone.js are quite complex. There's lots of references to different values, different parameters for synthesizers and samplers and things like that. And so, yeah, using objects, it gives us a lot of power to create complex components in our code, but it can be a little bit tricky to understand at first. Let's see, I think I've covered most of the syntax stuff that I want to talk about. Uh, oh yeah, I should talk about dot versus bracket notation. And then we'll move on. Okay, so most of what I've been doing so far is called dot notation. So spaceship dot name is dot notation. We use a dot after the object and then the property value that we want. We can also use what's called bracket notation. So let's do a bracket notation example down here. Uh, and bracket notation is useful for if I have like a value that I want to assign as a key. Oh, that's something else that I didn't quite explain. So let's talk about this here. So when we're creating an object, we have keys. And then a key refers to a value, which is either a property or a method. And so in our spaceship, like name is a key, position is a key, launch is a key, and then the value or property is whatever is associated with that. And we can actually get that out of JavaScript. So if I say something like console.log object.keys, and then I put my spaceship in there, it'll tell me all the keys that are associated with this object. So let's refresh. And so here is my object.keys. So it has name, position, and launch. So when we talk about a key, we're talking about like the name of the thing in the object, and then the key points to whatever the value is, which is either a property or a method, which again is either a function or a variable. Sorry, there's a lot of new terms here, but we need to learn these as programmers. So most of the time we can use dot notation. That's a lot simpler to write if we know the name of the key that we want to assign something to. But sometimes we don't know the name of the key. It might be its own variable. And so in that case, using bracket notation is useful. So let's say we had another object. So let's say within our program we have a spaceship, and let's say we also have a planet. So we'll say we have a variable planet, or let's use constant to be consistent. So we have a variable planet, and that's an empty object to start. And then let's say, we can use bracket notation. So we can say planet and then bracket. So instead of using a dot, I can use brackets, and now I can create a key using a string. So I could say like, what's the name of the planet, and assign that to Earth. But I can also use variables for those keys. So let's say I had a constant. What else would we associate with a planet? We might want to associate like the size of the planet. So let's say I had a constant called property. This is sort of a goofy example, but let's say I have a size property. And let's say I just want to assign, I have a bunch of different properties that I want to assign to all of my planets. But instead of doing them each one at a time, I want to do it in like a loop or something like that. Then I might have like my property size, and I can say planet at prop equals, and then let's say the size of the Earth is 100 in whatever unit I'm currently making up. So then let's log our planet. So we'll say console.log our planet. Well, yeah, let's do a string first. So planet and then planet, so we know what we're looking at. And let's take a look at the console over here, which is nice and big. So now we have a new object where there's a planet and it has the name Earth and the size 100. So that's bracket notation. We're not going to use this a lot, so I wouldn't worry about this quite as much, but you will see it in examples, so you should be aware of it. And they're interchangeable, so if I use bracket notation to set a value, that doesn't mean I have to use it to reference a value. I can say planet dot name and it will still work as long as it matches the key that I created. Oh, did I run this? Okay, so yeah, you can see planet here and then the key Earth, the name Earth here. So you can mix and match these. They're pretty much the same thing. It's just using a dot with the property name versus brackets with the property name. Okay, so one more thing with objects is functions that return objects. And there's like a million other things to talk about when it comes to what this is doing, but we're just going to kind of talk about it real quick, just so you guys understand some of the syntax that you might see with Tone.js. Functions can return objects. Okay, so we have one spaceship, right? It's just one object. That's all we can have the way it's written here. Same thing with our planet. But let's say we have something that we want like a bunch of copies of. So what we would want is instead of just one object literal, which is what this is, we would create an object constructor function, which is what we're going to create here. So let's say our spaceship is going to, shoot asteroids, but we want more than one asteroid. So if I just said constant asteroid, I would have to like do the same thing I was talking about before, where I'd have to have like asteroid 1, asteroid 2, and that would get really tedious. So instead of that, what we can do is make a function that creates an asteroid for us. And this is called this is called a lot of different things, but we can think of this as a function constructor. An object constructor function. So it creates this like kind of idea of an object, and then we can make as many as we want. So for this one, we're just going to have a function, and usually an object constructor function will start with a capital letter. So we'll call it asteroid. And usually there's some parentheses. We can put some parameters in here. Let's say there's a size parameter for our asteroid. And what a function constructor does is it's going to return an object so we can make copies of it. So we're going to use the return key and then just put an object right here. Actually, let's make this a little more verbose. So let's say constant asteroid. And so we'll create an object and then we'll return that object. And so, did I spell asteroid right? I think that looks right. So this is what it is when you see all of these Tone.js examples that say things like constant synth gets new tone.synth. This is what's happening there, is there's a constructor function inside of Tone that's going to create a new synth for us and give it back to us so we can assign it to a synth. So that's what's happening most of the time. It's actually it's a bit more complicated than that, but this is essentially what's happening. So let's say we have an asteroid, and inside the asteroid, it has a size. So we're just going to assign the size to size. And then let's say it also has a function to orbit. So we'll say there's an orbit function. And this is just going to console.log I am orbiting. So it's not actually doing anything, but this is just an example. Okay, so now this is what's called a constructor function because it's sort of like a blueprint for what an asteroid should be. And we can make asteroids based on this blueprint. So if I want to make some asteroids, I can say console.log new asteroid, and I can give it a size. So I have to have a size here. Let's say it's 100, the same size as the planet apparently. And then I can do this like as many times as I want. So let's do one new asteroid, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this a few times. And I'll do 2, 3, 4, and I'll do asteroids of various sizes just to show that each one is unique. So we'll do 10, 50, and 20. And then I'm just going to run this code just as an example. And so here we go. We have so each one of these is an asteroid. So one, the size is 100, and it has this little orbit function. And then 2, same thing. 3, same thing here. 4, same thing here. Each one has its own size, and each one has its own orbit function. So that's what we do if we want to have an object that we need a bunch of copies of. We can create a constructor function. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. There are other ways to do it, but this is basically how it looks. We make an object inside of the function, and then we return that object to wherever the function was. And then if we were using this in real code, not just like logging it, we would say something like constant asteroid 1 equals new asteroid. And then we would give it a size. So this bit at the end may not make that much sense. It's a little bit more advanced, but you will see some examples like that. So hopefully that'll make a little bit of sense. But we're not going to use that in our code today. I just wanted to go over that to kind of just cover everything. Well, not everything, but cover enough things when it comes to objects that they'll sort of make sense. So yeah, that's everything I want to cover with objects for now. We are going to use them in our example in P5 in Tone. So we'll go in and directly use them. But yeah, let me stop the recording and see if there's any questions, and then we'll get into our